Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Gates, Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. Thank you for joining this webinar entitled Section 106 Webinar Series, Module 1, What is Section 106? The format for today's webinar will include a presentation followed by time for questions and answers. There is a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and I will hold the question till the end for the panelists to answer. You will be muted throughout the presentation. To hide and unhide this toolbar, click on the orange arrow. Today's presentation will be by Gloria Scott and Tristan Tozer. Gloria Scott holds a BA in History from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a Master of Science in Historic Preservation from the University of Vermont, where she became a member of the Society for Commercial Archaeology in its founding year. She has been working in the field of historic preservation for 33 years, including 24 years as an architectural historian at Caltrans. Currently, she is Chief of the Built Environment Preservation Services branch in the Caltrans Division of Environmental Analysis, and is the Caltrans member on the State Historical Building Safety Board. Ms. Scott has worked in various capacities in the City of Cincinnati's Urban Conservation Office, the Ohio and Arizona Historic Preservation Offices, and the Central Virginia Planning District Commission. Her experience includes evaluating rural, urban, industrial, and roadside buildings and structures, writing preservation policies, procedures, and manuals, managing rehabilitation and survey grants, reviewing projects for compliance with state and federal historic preservation laws, as well as rehabilitation investment tax credit projects, conducting cultural resource compliance workshops, and making presentations on the National Register of Historic Places, the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, architectural history, especially for roadside architecture and mid-20th century architecture, and downtown revitalization. She has also given numerous presentations at California Preservation Foundation's conferences and workshops. Tristan Tozer is a state historian. He has worked for the California State Historic Preservation Officers Review and Compliance Unit for 3.5 years. Mr. Tozer has studied at UC Davis and Sacramento State and is close to completing a master's degree in public history. Thank you for joining us today, Gloria and Tristan.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, this is Tristan Tozer. I'll be going first. Well, hello all. As Jennifer said, I work in the California Office of Historic Preservation's Review and Compliance Unit. I'm the primary reviewer for 15 different federal agencies, from the Health and Human Services and Health Resources Services Administration on down to the United States Postal Service. I also chime in on some other agencies when the need arises. I know a bit about what I'm doing, and I hope today's presentation might shine some light on the nature of what constitutes consultation, and I hope it may be of help to some of you in attendance. Okay, I'll be going over the first 4 steps of the Section 106 consultation process. I'll give you a couple words about the Section 106 process. The process is it's a regulatory program that SHPO administers to promote historic preservation. Section 106 is the implementing regulations of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended. It's a program that is grounded in administrative law. And in a general sense, the Section 106 consultation process is a way of getting the federal government to consider the effects that projects it permits, grants, or funds might have on historic properties. And what does the Section 106 process require? It requires a federal agency, and the federal agency must take into account the effect of an undertaking on National Register listed or eligible properties before approving federal funds or issuing any federal license, and should also allow the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation a reasonable opportunity to comment. And I'll be talking about the Advisory Council and undertakings, identification efforts, all in the next few minutes here. Okay, to go forward, I think it'd be wise to identify the players, the 5 key persons and organizations and staffs who comment and consult in this project. The public and interested parties obviously are more loose-knit and make up a number of other persons, but I'll go from there. I'll start with the Advisory Council. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is an independent federal agency that promotes the preservation, enhancement, and productive use of America's historic resources. The agency also advises the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP is generally involved in standard consultations when the agency and the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Officer, are at an impasse, such as in the resolution of adverse effects phase. And that will be handled in a later module. I will make reference to it, but that will be later on in the series. The creation of agreement documents and programmatic agreements will be handled in more detail. Another big player is the federal agency. Agencies initiate undertakings. Without an agency allocating or dispersing funds, there would be no undertakings, and thus no resulting consultation in No. 106. Next, I will mention the State Historic Preservation Officer and Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. TIPOs and SHPOs, for short, oversee the implementation of preservation at a statewide level or a tribal government level. All 50 states and various territories have SHPOs and TIPOs. And as a result of amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1992, federally recognized tribes have a preservation component overseen by the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. The TIPO's role is similar in many ways to the SHPO's. And my fourth grouping there is the public, interested parties, and cultural resource management consultants. They make up what is collectively referred to as the interested public. Under the regulations, persons or organizations with an opinion regarding the effects of a project might have on a historic property must be given the opportunity to comment or provide input. And to make sure that all the players are working in concert and having time to opine on effects, we have a 4-step Section 106 process. That's at 36 CFR 800.3 through 6. It does go farther, but for the purposes of this consultation, we're going to be focusing on kind of the beginning of this the consultation process. Okay, step 1. This is the initiation of the Section 106 process. And I should also add before I go on that it's important to note that an agency is required to consult with the SHPO at each step in the process. Steps can be collapsed into a single round of consultation, but this approach must be agreed upon prior to consultation initiation or established while you're initiating it. And the SHPO has to agree to work under this process. I find that combining steps 1 through or 3 through 6 works best for smaller projects. Okay, I've actually got ahead of myself. I'm going to go back 1 slide. All right. Okay, step 1, I'll call this. This is a 36 CFR 800.3 in the regulations. It's the initiation of the Section 106 process. An agency has to determine if the action they're proposing to fund or grant or permit, whatever it may be, is an undertaking. For example, if money will be used by the agency to purchase computer equipment or paint the exterior of a recently constructed building, one can reasonably argue that the project is not an undertaking. However, if funds will be used to replace windows on an older building or used for the excavation and installation of a water conveyance system, this would certainly constitute an undertaking that could affect historic properties, should they be present. So you have to determine if you have an undertaking. And if you do have an undertaking, you have to think about the project's, the undertaking or the project's potential to affect historic properties. The agency then will take into account the undertaking's potential to affect historic properties. If the agency is unsure, if it is readily apparent that there's a potentially potential to adversely affect historic properties, a consultant or a staff member who meets the Secretary of the Interior's professional qualifications should be brought on board. Next, you initiate consultation with the SHPO, or the TIPO as well. Once the agency has established that it has an undertaking, you notify the SHPO and the TIPO via a letter. The letter should introduce the project via a project description and photographs at this time. You'll also want to, while you're doing this, identify and contact interested parties. The agency, again, must make an effort to solicit the opinion of interested parties. This could include Native American tribal groups and entities, local historical societies, civic organizations, or homeowners groups. You want to consider the scale and scope of your project and notify accordingly. And also, you should consider the possibility of, that the public might be interested and want to be involved and active during the consultation. So you should give the public time to comment. Ideally 30 days is good. Send out project descriptions and timelines. If you know where, say, historical societies meet, you might want to send them a letter or put up something. If meetings and public hearings are going to be required, you might want to make venue arrangements or facilitate other ways to meet. You'll want to be ready to bring people to the table if there is indeed a desire for that from the interested public. All right, the next section, 36 CFR 800.4, this is the identification of historic properties. The agency needs to determine the area of potential effects, better known as the APE. And the agency must define the APE. And this is kind of an important part of the Section 106 consultation process. The delineation of the area of potential effects, it kind of defines the universe of the Section 106 consultation. The AP results in a formal determination of the locations and the types of properties that will and won't be considered under Section 106. So in simple terms, the APE, the area of potential effects, defines the field of play for kind of the broader Section 106 consultation. So once the APE is determined and the SHPO has concurred with the APE, historic properties that may lie outside of the AP are essentially off the table. They're no longer given consideration. And again, the delineation of the APE should be commensurate kind of with the scale and scope of the undertaking. If the agency is unsure how big or small to make the APE, it's probably best to solicit some comments from people with knowledge of the process. You can certainly ask the SHPO. You can also get a person to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards who are versed in working in California to help the agency delineate the APE. And we'll talk about APEs a little later. We have some graphics. I will get into it, and Gloria will as well. You'll also want to identify the existing or potential historic properties within the APE. Once you've got a geographic area together, you can do this in a number of ways. In California, the state maintains what is known as the CRIT system, another acronym there. It's the California Historic Resources Information System for short, and it's a good place to start. California maintains its built environment and archaeological properties in a number of regional information centers scattered throughout the state. They typically host one or more counties' files and records. It's a good place to go to see what kind of work has gone on before and what is included in, or what historic properties have been listed or are eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. You might also want to, another good place to go is to contact the Native American Heritage Commission. The Native American Heritage Commission maintains a list of addresses of federally recognized and unrecognized tribes, in the regions, throughout California. So if you were to ask about tribes tribal groups and entities and organizations, say from the Los Angeles area, they could provide you with a number of addresses in which you can contact TIPOs or other tribal representatives and request information or ask for concerns about a project area. And again, just it allows you to stand out other persons who might have a knowledge or interest in the project area, properties within or adjacent to the APE. You should also note that historic properties are those that are listed, for the terms of consultation, historic properties are defined as properties that are listed on or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. And if necessary, an agency should evaluate properties for eligibility for their listing on the National Register of Historic Places. For example, if you're going to demolish a series of buildings to accommodate the construction of a hospital or a clinic, you'll want to know about the age of those buildings. If they are over 50 years of age, even less so, depending on the architectural style, you'll want to know if they're eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. You may have to have an historian who meets the Secretary of the Interior's professional qualifications go out and make that call. They will evaluate the property and determine whether it is or is not, or the properties are or are not eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Okay, step 3. This is CFR 800.5. This is the assessment of adverse effects. If the potential effects of an undertaking are not adverse, the step results in a finding of no adverse effects, and the consultation is concluded. So if the agency comes forward and says, yes, there are some historic properties within the APE, but this project is not going to adversely affect them. There'll be no impact. The pipelines will be away from archaeological sites. We have reason to believe through research that there's little chance of affecting archaeological sites. Fill has been used here in the past. We're only going down a couple feet, and you can demonstrate that the old historic house that might be in the APE will not be affected. Then the agency can reason that finding of no adverse effect is appropriate, and the SHPO can look at your finding and all of the supporting documentation and say, yes, we agree with you, and then the consultation would be concluded. If the effects will be adverse, the step results in the finding of adverse effects, and we move on to the next step. This is the resolution of adverse effects. And again, one of the later module series this summer will go into some detail about the creation of agreement documents and kind of that part of the resolution of adverse effects. But I'll just go briefly here. An agency must consider alternatives to avoid adverse effects. If you have one, is there another way? Could a road be rerouted? Could a property be adaptively reused rather than demolished? An agency is going to want to show that they've considered alternatives. If adverse effects cannot be avoided, if there are no alternatives, the federal agency must notify the advisory council, let them know about the undertaking and the fact that there will be an adverse effect, and solicit their opinion on solutions or how to go forward. Oftentimes, almost all the time, this leads to the development of a memorandum of agreement or a programmatic agreement to resolve adverse effects. Again, this will be covered in a later module series. And note that the resolution can include minimizing or mitigating effects. Oftentimes it's not an all or nothing avoid or cancel the project. There may be a way to go forward where you minimize it, or there are some more severe effects on the front end, but some other areas effects are much less. That's all developed in consultation. And typically when you get to this step in the process, the standard 30 days, which I'll go into a second, the standard time frame it's longer. It's more drawn out. You don't have these immediate week after week consultations. You tend to hand back and forth copies of agreement documents. Each side makes their opinions known and provides drafts and revisions until it gets to a point where all of the players involved are comfortable with going forward with the agreement. Now, something most people are curious about, I get it on almost every call I get from someone from an agency or someone representing an agency, is how long will this process take? They want to know what the time frame is. And that's defined at 36 CFR 800.3C4. Okay, the failure of a SHPO or a TIPO to respond. If a SHPO or a TIPO fails to respond within 30 days of receipt of a request for review of a finding or determination, the agency official may either proceed to the next step in the process based on the finding or determination, or consult with the council in lieu of the SHPO or TIPO. If the SHPO or the TIPO re-enters the Section 106 process, the agency official shall continue the consultation without being required to reconsider previous findings or determinations. That doesn't happen all that often, but it's a way of saying, hey, legally, if somehow we have not been involved in these first steps, we can't go back and just start the whole thing over again. Projects do have to move. But again, you have the SHPO and the TIPO have 30 days to comment on each step. And if an agency has not come forward and agreed that they were compressing the timeline, they were wrapping up or collapsing the steps, then that's still, if that hasn't been established, that won't work. So if you are concerned with, again, if you're an agency and want to compress or collapse the steps, that's something you should establish right away and early on. Now, this might work in more of a classroom setting where I can see people and we can have hands raised, but we should talk for a bit about what constitutes an undertaking. I've put some scenarios up, and just consider and think about if these might be undertakings. Okay, the Navy plans to buy paper clips. Would that be an undertaking? Knowing what you know now? I would say no. Okay, the National Park Service is mowing the grass at the Ahwahnee, which is National Register property in Yosemite. Again, you could argue no. If you're going out to mow the grass, a maintenance man is out there doing that. That's not an undertaking. However, if there's some landscaping involved, I'm not sure in this particular case if the landscape is a contributor. I believe that it is. Then you would have an undertaking. Okay, the United States Marine Corps will be painting a building listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Would that be an undertaking? Think about it. In most cases, I would say it wouldn't be an undertaking. Painting is, it's reversible. I mean, it should be considered when you're sometimes local preservation ordinances are very strict about appearance and the maintenance of buildings, and that could come into play. You'd probably be a little more concerned when an agency was proposing the removal of paint from an historic property. Once you get sandblasting and start using silicates and various solvents that could affect the historic material of the building, that could become an issue. And that is something, again, if you have an undertaking in which you're proposing this kind of an activity, it would be good to consult a person, an historic architect, for example, who meets the Secretary of the Interior's professional qualifications and can do the work to meet the Secretary of the Interior's standards for historic rehabilitation or the rehabilitation of historic properties. Now imagine if the Forest Service was to approve a camping permit. It's a permitted action. It's going to allow persons to camp and inhabit and walk around on some acreage out in the forest. Yes, I would argue, and as most people would, that would be an undertaking. There's a potential there to affect historic properties, prehistoric sites. So yes, that's something you'd want to talk to the SHPO about. All right, the National Park Service approving a special use permit for the America's Cup viewing at Crissy Field. That would certainly be an undertaking. That's a permit. It's going to allow people on or near historic properties and may result in the alterations of historic properties. Yeah, that's certainly something you'd want to consult on. The Veterans Affairs constructing a new building in a National Register of Historic Places listed historic district. Think about that one. Certainly that would be an undertaking. Historic buildings might have to be demolished. This new building might be out of the massing and scale of the other buildings that make up the district. This can certainly affect the district. So I would argue that would be an undertaking that you'd have to consult on. Imagine a FEMA providing funding to replace windows in a building constructed in 1932. Again, that certainly would be an undertaking that you should consult on. The building, the building was constructed in 1932. may be eligible for listing on the National Register, either individually or as part of a district. That's something that would be worked out in consultation. For Caltrans widening a state highway, certainly an undertaking. Property takes and maybe any kind of resulting demolition or grading could affect archaeological properties and also or artifacts, as well as the built environment. Sometimes neighborhoods are affected by these projects. So this is certainly something that you'd want to consult on. Okay, and I just have a few slides I wanted to get into delineating an APE. If you're getting anything out of this at all, you really should, I'd hope you take home with you the fact that creating a reasonable or delineating a reasonable APE is a very good thing to complete early on. Oftentimes, and this is true of a number of projects related to HRSA funding or the Health Resources Services Administration, or sometimes the Department of Energy, where you get the government, the agency is letting the applicants basically do all of the consultation. They're told, hey, you have to delineate an APE and given little else to do. So what they'll do is say, hey, yeah, we're a clinic in Northridge. Here we are. And you get the greater Los Angeles area. That's a bit excessive as an APE. I doubt minor renovations to the interior of a building constructed in 1975 is going to affect properties in Topanga Canyon or Pasadena. So you want to really consider the scale and scope of your undertaking when delineating an APE. A better approach now is if you're replacing a windows or installing a fence around a property, say built in 1932, it's more reasonable to assume that the APE would include the building and possibly neighboring buildings. You'd want to know if you had an historic district or you were working in the vicinity of an historic district. Then your project could affect historic properties. So it might be reasonable to draw the APE for this project as, say, this larger area. Then you'll have someone look at the buildings. It might not be necessary to evaluate all the buildings, but just kind of get a general sense of the historic makeup of the neighborhood. And indeed, if there is an indicator that you have an historic district, that could have an effect on your window replacement and the installation of the fence. But again, you want to establish a clear area of potential effects. Again, say you do some background research and you find that this neighborhood has undergone numerous alterations over the years. You have some houses from the 30s, some from the 50s, condominiums from the 70s, a relatively modern strip mall or shopping center across the street, and some warehouses. Then you might not have a cohesive district. And there may, if you could find, you do some initial investigation and you find there aren't other houses of this type nearby, or there were but they're long demolished, then maybe you could delineate the APE as just the house alone. You can have a more narrow APE, area of potential effects. But we find it best, and it's kind of standard practices in California, when delineating an APE, it's very good to get kind of an aerial image, something taken possibly from some kind of mapping software, and delineating the APE. I mean, here it looks like we have two APEs, and we have the proposed location and these standing structures, but this would all be considered one area of potential effects. And this is good. This is showing that this is the direct area of effects they'll be digging, and they're also considering effects that might, affect historic properties that are within the general vicinity of the project. So I'd encourage anyone out there working for an agency or an applicant who's in receipt of a grant who needs to delineate an area of potential effects to do it this way. And I would like to also say now that the identification process should not be taken out by a person who does not meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. You work for an agency, but if you don't have the professional qualifications or the know-how to go out and identify properties, you have to have someone do so. but you can certainly delineate, the agency can certainly delineate the area of potential effects. And it's very good to get that geographic area sorted out early on. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's a big one. Always consider the area of potential effects. And thank you. I'm going to hand over the presentation now to Gloria Scott.
Thank you, Tristan, and thank you for elaborating on the importance of the area of potential effect, because like the historic property, that carries forward through all of the steps of the Section 106 process. And so what are historic properties, and how do they fit into Section 106? Well, sometimes the terms can be very confusing, but they're very specific and they serve a specific purpose within Section 106. So first, let's start with kind of a recap of what Section 106 requires. It requires the federal agency to take into account an undertaking's effect on National Register listed or eligible properties before approving the federal action and affording the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation a reasonable opportunity to comment. Well, you've heard National Register listed or eligible now for approximately half an hour. That's the backbone of Section 106. And as you can see, it's one of the first steps in Section 106. We're at identifying historic properties, which is 36 CFR 800.4. CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's the regulations that the Advisory Council implements. The bullet underneath identifying historic properties, that's 800.5, is where assessing effects begins, and the bullets after that will be covered in later modules. So under identifying historic properties, we have evaluate for National Register significance. And that entails applying the National Register criteria to all of the properties that are within the APE, evaluating them for their historical significance using that criteria, and then consulting with the State Historic Preservation Officer, the SHPO, or the TIPO, on National Register eligibility. And as Tristan mentioned earlier, the steps through this step at 800.4 can be combined into one document and one letter that goes to SHPO if there's been an agreement to do so. Okay, so the terms. There are very specific terms that are legal terms. Whoops. Goodness, it must be time there. An historic property is a federal term, and it's a legal term under Section 106. And it includes all the different types of property types that make up the National Register of Historic Places. That means that an historic property could be an archaeological site, but we don't use the certain term site, we use the term historic property. And it means very specifically properties that are listed or eligible for the National Register. That's opposed to the state term, which is historical resource, and that's specific to California state law affecting cultural resources in California. Again, it's a legal term, and it includes the National Register properties in addition to a variety of other properties. For Section 106 purposes, the terms are not interchangeable. We're always talking about historic properties when we talk about 106. So what is the National Register? Well, it's the nation's inventory, master inventory of properties that are worthy of preservation in 50 states and the territories, and it's composed of these property types that you see on the screen. And those property types must be significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. And they can be significant at the local, state, or national significance. The majority of properties listed in the National Register and the majority of properties determined eligible for the National Register are at the local level of significance, and that's by far the most commonly found level of significance for both processes, both for listing and for determinations of eligibility. So the National Register criteria, they're the A, B, C's, and D's of the process. And to be eligible or to be listed in the National Register, a property must meet one or more of these criteria, starting with A, properties that are associated with significant events in our past, either in history or prehistory, and that can be a series of events such as the development of interstate commerce, or it can be a significant event such as a treaty site. The second criterion B is for properties that are associated with the lives of persons who have made significant contributions to our past. This is probably the most misunderstood and the least applied criterion. It can be sometimes difficult to differentiate events from persons, but it is there, and we've got a number of properties in California that have been determined eligible and listed under criterion B. Criterion C is kind of a catch-all criterion that has to do with what something looks like or how it's built. So it's a property that is significant because it is an example of a type, period, or method of construction, is a significant architectural style, or it's the work of a master, has high artistic values, or this last one is a distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction, is like an historic district where you might have a row or blocks of houses that are very similar looking, and each one is not really distinctive in and of itself, but when you're going through that neighborhood, you get a very distinctive sense of time and place. And if it is significant in that locality, or even at the regional, state, or national level, then it could be eligible for the National Register. And the last one, criterion D, has to do with the ability for a property to yield or have the potential to yield significant information, and I'd like to underscore significant. It can't be just any old information. It needs to be information that's going to add to our knowledge of history or prehistory. Typically, this is where archaeological resources fall. And that's the most often criterion that's used for them. Archaeological resources could be significant under any of the other criterion, but usually it's under criterion D. And by the same token, a building or an historic district could be eligible under criterion D if it can yield information we don't already know about our past. You'll notice here that they're capitalized. The criteria, the National Register criteria, typically are capitalized. And an easy way to remember them is A for activity, B for big people, C for cute or character, and D for data. In addition to being significant under one of the 4 criteria I just mentioned, a property, in order to be determined eligible or listed, needs to have integrity, and that's a simple yes or no question. And integrity is the ability of a property to convey its significance, and it's got to have it in order to be eligible or listed. Okay, I'd like to go through just a series of the different property types that could be eligible for the National Register. In the upper left is an early gas station. It's a rare surviving property type when gas stations were first being used. A lot of times old country stores were converted to put gas pumps out front, and then they were combined as gas stations and stores. And this one is an early example of it. So under property type, it is significant for the and meets the criteria for listing on the National Register, but it's also associated with auto-oriented commerce in Alexander Valley. The other three are all examples of properties that are significant for their architecture. The bottom is at the bottom left is the Caltrans office at the Trans Lab, the transportation laboratory where many tests go on, and there are laboratory rooms in there. You'll see more pictures of that later. On the lower right is an architect-designed mid-century modern building that's part of a school in Pasadena that is significant and for its 20th century architecture. And the upper right is the classic house that people think of, a Queen Anne house that is architecturally significant. Structures are differentiated from buildings because it could be anything from a road to a water tower, but they're typically not properties that are inhabited by people. And what we see here in the upper left is the Rose Bowl, which is nationally significant because of its association with collegiate football and with the Tournament of Roses and their efforts with the football games and the Rose Parade. On the upper right is a masonry arch bridge that is significant for its construction. That's criterion C again. The lower left is the U.S. Pomponito submarine, which saw service during World War II in the Pacific, and that's the reason for its significance. And the lower right is the Lodi Arch, which is associated both with the efforts at commerce in Lodi and for its mission revival architecture. That's also listed on the National Register. Sites are commonly determined eligible. At the upper left we have Vasquez Rocks, which is a series of archaeological sites. And in this case, its surrounding environment is also important. And when Tristan was talking about APEs, if there was a project here, one would need to draw the direct APE that for archaeological sites that he was mentioning, but in this case the environment also is the surrounding environment and potential impacts on that environment would need to be discussed in establishing an area of potential effects. The same is true for the lower left photograph, which is Manzanar, and its isolation on the east side of the Sierra is one of its major features and would need to be considered were any federally funded project to happen in or near Manzanar. The lower right is a tree row that is listed in the National Register. Caltrans first determined it eligible for the National Register, and it's associated with an event that happened throughout California having to do with planting trees in commemoration of Arbor Day and beautification of the highways. Objects also can be determined eligible, and they're as varied as a Southern Pacific Communications kiosk that is part of a larger historic property of the Northwestern Railroad. The upper right is the South San Francisco Hillside sign, which is listed in the National Register and is significant for its property type and for the boosterism of San Francisco, as an industrial city. More commonly thought of as objects is the statue in the lower left, which I believe is in Visalia, and it's the work of a well-known sculptor. The center slide is an air raid siren in Los Angeles that wound up being moved, and it's from 1951, but it's associated with the civil defense program in the United States during the early years of the Cold War. And the lower right is one that can give some people a lot of heartache, especially when they remember properties like this being built, but it is significant. The Circus Liquor sign as an exemplary example of neon signage, and the rise of automobile culture. The sign happens to be in North Hollywood. So those are examples of individual properties, but we also have districts, and what people typically think of are the residential or commercial districts, such as the Markham Place Historic District in the upper left corner in Pasadena, and the Eureka Historic District in Eureka, which is significant for its late 19th and early 20th century residential and commercial properties, as opposed to Markham Place, which is the same era, but it's all residential properties, and the landscaping and the layout is very important. The lower left is the Joel McCrea Ranch, and it's significant at the national level, is significant for its association with Joel McCrea, who is a major movie star. But it is also significant as a ranch complex and for its early California ranch style. And this is another situation that if you were doing something here, the acreage around the property also would need to be considered in an area of potential effects, because that's the context for the Joel McCrea Ranch. The lower right is the R Street corridor in Sacramento, and that's an industrial corridor. Trains used to run down the center of the road. The tracks are still there. And it's significant in the development of industry in Sacramento in the early 20th century. They all are going to have different character-defining features. They all are going to be treated somewhat differently in the 106 process, depending on the projects that would occur that would affect these properties. Okay, I've been talking about individually listed and eligible and historic districts. So what do they mean in terms of 106? An individually listed or eligible property is individually meets the National Register criteria. It doesn't have to be an historic district, but you can have a property that's individually eligible within an historic district to which it can be a contributor. But it's basically can stand alone, whereas an historic district is a grouping of resources that are linked either historically or aesthetically, and we've seen some examples of both. And as I mentioned earlier, whose individual components lack distinction, but taken together they convey significance or a sense of time and place. And within that, these are terms, sometimes people will say a contributing feature, a contributing property, or just contributor. But a contributor adds to historic significance because it was present during the historic period. So for an historic district that is significant between 1875 to 1930, it means it was built within that time frame. If it was built in 1965, it wouldn't be a contributor. It also has to relate to the documented significance for the historic district. So if you've got a late 19th century neighborhood that's been considered a district, and you have a Quonset hut or a gas station from the 60s, that doesn't relate to the documented significance, so it wouldn't be a contributor to the district. Contributors also need to possess historic integrity, and if they're significantly altered and they don't convey that sense of time and place, then they would not be considered contributors. And again, as I mentioned earlier, something can be individually eligible for the National Register and at the same time be a contributor. And a good example are bridges that are on the Feather River Highway in Northern California, and several of the bridges are individually eligible for their engineering, but they're also contributors to the Feather River Highway Historic District. Contributors have the same protection as individually eligible properties. So if you're planning to demolish a portion of a building that's a contributor to an historic district, then that can trigger the Section 106 process. And in that case, you would be looking at what's happening to that contributor plus how it affects a district. And later modules will cover that. A non-contributor obviously is just the opposite. It wasn't present, it doesn't relate to the documented significance, and it lacks historic integrity. Here's examples of individually listed and eligible properties. In this case, most of these are eligible for their architectural style. On the upper right is a double bascule bridge on the Sacramento River, and that it's significant for its association with the Victory Highway and with commerce in the Delta. In the center is the Stevens House in Malibu. It was built in 1968, and it's an exemplary example of modernist design. So we've got quite a range of properties that are considered eligible. We also have the Berkeley Iceland skating rink, PG&E substation in Sacramento, and a Queen Anne house in Arcata. They're all eligible under Criterion C. And historic districts, this is a good example of where you can see components that as a group convey significance and where the individuals might lack distinction. This is the Shortline Villa Historic District in Los Angeles, and as you can see, all the houses have kind of a uniform setback. They're 1 to 2 stories. They've got these great acorn globe street lights and winding streets and mature vegetation. And that is what identifies this neighborhood and gives it its distinctive historic character. And then we have a contributor to the district. Now this house is not individually eligible, but it retains integrity, and it's an early 20th century property that is like so many of the others within the neighborhood. And an important part of what you're doing when you're evaluating historic properties is preparing for the next steps in the process. So you need to know what is it about the property and what is it that we might affect by our projects, and be able to describe that. And that's done by identifying what are called essential physical features or character-defining features. The terms are used interchangeably. And what they are distinctive and tangible elements that are visible features that convey that historic appearance and is indispensable to the historic significance of a property. The character-defining features are directly related to the National Register criteria and why a property is eligible in the first place. And when we're looking at tangible elements, we're looking at things like the overall shape, the materials, craftsmanship, details of a property. If it's a building, we might be looking at the interior spaces and features, as well as the site and environment. And depending on what your project is, you may be concentrating more, for instance, on the interior of a building, if you're going to be doing a rehabilitation, than you would on the site and environment, and would have probably greater description of those elements in your evaluation of why the property is significant, whereas an agency like mine, Caltrans, is going to concentrate on the site and the environment, because that's the more likely character-defining features we would be impacting in the later step in the process. And this is true with National Register nominations. If you have a property that was listed, say, 20 or 30 years ago, it may not describe the character-defining features that you need to focus on, and that's where, as Tristan said earlier, it's really important to have a qualified professional who's able to do that, prepare that information from you, because that becomes very important in the next steps in the process. And so the components that make up character-defining features, typically we're looking at their craftsmanship, their significance, and again in relationship to why a property is eligible in the first place. Because we're using public money or as a public permit, we kind of need to look at what's the public benefit of that character-defining feature in terms of conveying significance. Is it visible, and does it have integrity? And some examples of craftsmanship are displayed on this slide, where we have a high-style craftsman door that has high artistic value, and it's got integrity of the design and materials, and we would say that's probably a pretty major component of this house. Whereas at the opposite end, we've got a kitchen that might be considered standard historic fabric and commonly found during the period of significance. So this is where you start looking at where you might have flexibility when you go to do mitigation. You may decide that it's important to keep the front door to this house, but we don't care about the kitchen. We can sacrifice the kitchen if we have to do mitigation in terms of rehabilitation. Another component, again, that I mentioned is significance. Is it quintessential and indispensable to conveying significance? Or is it low, where if you lose, in this case, one detached garage in an historic district, it may not cause a problem. But if there's a plan to remove all of them, then it can result in a cumulative effect. Whereas the opposite, if you're planning streetscape improvements in this historic district, that would change the sidewalks or the curbing or the mature landscaping, or you're putting in a building that is not set back uniformly, then you have the potential to diminish the historic character of the historic district. So in the case on the left, it would be a quintessential and indispensable character-defining feature for this district. Public benefit is a little bit harder to get a handle on, but again, if there's high public access, in this case with the streets and the sidewalks, and it being very strongly evocative of this early 20th century neighborhood, that might be a feature that you need to bring out in your evaluation, as opposed to a space that you might not even have access to, a public space like a backyard. In this case, this backyard had a buried swimming pool, and that's what you're looking at here. Visibility, again, is something that is important, and when you're talking about historic districts, if you're affecting the exteriors of buildings or something across the street from a building, then a bathroom in a building might not be so important, but being able to convey significance through an entryway would be important. Integrity is another component of character-defining features, and on the left you can see a library that is intact as designed, and there have been no alterations to it, as opposed to the room on the right, where at a much later period in time the room was substantially altered by adding floor-to-ceiling cabinets and cupboards. And again, as I mentioned, one has to go back to the period of significance and why a property is eligible. And in this example for the Translab main building, this period of significance is 1958 and is significant for its architecture. So in identifying character-defining features, we needed to look at why it was significant and that 1958 date. And the character-defining features are enumerated in the left, and as you can see, We've got a courtyard here with these louvers, which are important, as well as these ribbon windows. The landscaping is typical 1950s landscaping, so this is a significant character-defining feature, as well as the overall massing and shape of the building, as you can see here. And again, the architectural treatments on the front of this building have been called out as character-defining features. And because this building is individually eligible, and we had a project to bring it up to code, we also needed to look at the interior, and the spaces that were identified as historically significant on the interior that convey significance are the lobby here with its built-in features, and this right here is a planter box. There's a sign here that's obliterating it somewhat, but this is a built-in planter box as well as built-in bookcases and things. And this is an auditorium in the building, and the sawtooth ceiling is a character-defining feature, as well as all of the paneled rooms and paneled walls and staged, all of a piece. And then one of the original laboratories here with these fire doors. This is a character-defining feature that directly relates to this building and its, believe it or not, its architectural style. It's just part of the significant fabric of the building. And the same is true with historic districts. And when you're looking at evaluating significance, providing the reason why, and for historic districts it's important to provide the boundaries and what are contributors and non-contributors. And in this instance, it's the property is the district, which is eligible under criteria A and C, and there's a description here of why it's important, and the period of significance here is 1888 to 1938. And once you have that information, then you can look at the character-defining features of the district, which in this case, we've got some diversity in housing styles, and curvilinear drives with formal open landscaping that allows visibility into the homes, cobblestone walls and pillars, and mature street trees and hedgerows. And what that looks like when you get out into the neighborhood is this. We've got the natural landscaping. We've got this diverse range in architecture, cobblestone retaining walls, and then in this particular zone of this neighborhood, there's less formal landscaping, but there are mature trees. District contributors, first you need to know what the significant features of a district are to be able to tell how the contributors fit into it. And in this case, the district features for this property are that it's mid-block, it's a medium lot size, and that's all part of what makes this neighborhood. It does have concrete sidewalks that are a feature of this district, and it has mature trees and foliage, and as well as being a style that is within the period of significance. And it relates to the district because of its natural landscaping, its architectural style, and how it's placed on the property in the neighborhood. That's how it ties into the historic district. Okay, to recap, character-defining features describe the physical features that convey significance in the sense of time and place. They support the National Register criteria in the determination of eligibility. They inform how proposed projects might affect what makes a property significant, and they can identify where there might be flexibility in design or mitigation. And when you're completing the first steps of Section 106, it's important to be succinct in the descriptions of the historic properties and have them predictable in the documents you send to SHPO. They're reviewing a lot of documents, and everything you can to make it easier for them will make your review go faster. And one of those is to have a good historic property summary. That should include the name of the historic property and the location, if it's not a confidential site, the applicable criteria and the reason why that criteria apply. You don't just say it's eligible under criterion A. You need to explain very briefly why it's eligible, the level of significance, the period of significance, and the historic property boundaries. All of that information is important in the next steps of the Section 106 process. So this is an example of how one could be written. This is for an individually eligible house, and this identifies the level of significance, the criterion, in this case it's C, and the reasons why criterion C applies, the period of significance, the boundaries, and a summary of the character-defining features. And in this case, there are interior features and exterior features because it's a house that Caltrans owns and we need to maintain it. So we need to have the full array of features in our consultation documents. An example for an historic district, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about this part. These features are important to identify in consulting with the SHPO because they affect the surrounding environment, and when you have street widening, streetscape improvements, you need to be able to articulate what makes the district significant or the property significant. If you're doing rehabilitation, you're going to be concentrating more on the interior, and this can become important for energy conservation and ADA accessibility, among other types of projects. You need to know, again, as I said earlier, where you have flexibility and where you need to preserve the character-defining features. And this is an historic district example. This is a district we were looking at earlier, and like as individual property, you can do a very good summary paragraph that has the name, the level of significance, its criterion, its period of significance, boundaries, and contributing features. And any type of resource can be written up like this, including a long linear resource. This is I believe, is a couple miles long, this particular parkway in Santa Barbara. But as you can see, it's got all the same information in a predictable pattern. And then how this helps SHPO is that when they concur or write back to the federal agency, they need to be able to repeat this information back. So if you can give it to them in a concise paragraph, they don't have to spend their time writing it up or looking for it in a document. Counting historic properties, this is an area that causes considerable confusion. And it's not a whole lot of fun to do, but it's pretty simple, as long as you know what one equals. And for Section 106 purposes, one property can be a house. It could be an historic district that's got hundreds of contributors in it. It's counted as one historic properties. This becomes important later when you're assessing effects to know that one district equals one historic property, a farm complex equals one historic property. It doesn't matter how many parts there are within it. It's the boundary of the property that defines the property, as well as its significance. So, for example, in an APE, if you have a listed historic district with 45 contributors, an eligible archaeological site, a tank house that isn't eligible, and 3 individually eligible buildings, you have 5 historic properties. Now you can elaborate in the description of the historic district to say that there are 45 contributors, but for Section 106 purposes, this property that's got, or this APE that's got well over 50 buildings in it, only has 5 historic properties. The listing process is somewhat different than the determination of eligibility process, and there are terms that people might say to you like, well, this was a formal DOE, or this was a consensus DOE. So I kind of wanted to go through a little bit of how this happened. When the National Register of Historic Places was established, it was established in 1966 as part of the National Historic Preservation Act. And the thought was you draw a big square around this property, and it told the federal agencies, you need to stay away from this property, it's historic. And the way to do that is you list the property. So listings would be prepared. And the way the National Register listing program is set up, anybody can prepare a National Register nomination. It gets submitted to the registration unit in the California Preservation Office, and that's a different unit than what the Section 106 program is under. So for listing, it goes to the registration unit. It goes before the State Historical Resources Commission. There's a public hearing. If the Resources Commission approves the document, the nomination, it then goes to the keeper of the National Register in Washington, D.C. It's noticed in the Federal Register, and after the public comment period in Washington, if there's no objection or comments or serious problems with the nomination, the keeper of the National Register lists it. Well, that process, is really slow when you're dealing with federal projects. So as part of Section 106, a formal determination of eligibility process was set up to speed up federal projects. And in that process, formal determinations of eligibility were prepared, and there was a special form to do that. It went to SHPO for review. SHPO then sent it on to the keeper of the National Register. The keeper of the National Register evaluated it, and if they concurred with it, then if they felt that the property was eligible, they would publish it in the Federal Register. The keeper determination of eligibility is final. Nobody can appeal the keeper's decision. Well, that sped the process up a bit, but still, especially in the 1980s, there were so many federally funded projects and permits and things that a faster system was needed. So the Advisory Council devised the consensus determination of eligibility, and that really has sped things up. It knocks out the step of going to the keeper unless there's a disagreement. So the current process that we use is that the federal agency or its delegated applicant prepares the evaluation for an historic property, submits it to the SHPO, and if the SHPO concurs, that step in Section 106 is complete. If the SHPO disagrees and the federal agency and the SHPO cannot come to a consensus, then it's forwarded on to the keeper of the National Register and becomes a formal DOE. And it becomes important later if you have mitigation that destroys a property. It tells you who you need to contact then to let them know this property is no longer extant. Or if, for instance, with a listed property, you know that you have to inform the keeper as well. So what we use is highlighted in red, and that's the consensus DOE. But do be aware that that means that it just goes to SHPO, and a formal DOE goes to the keeper in Washington, D.C. Again, as Tristan mentioned earlier, in the first steps, which is 800 through 800.4, the federal agency needs to consult on the identification efforts, including the APE, the plan for involving the public, identifying the consulting parties, and evaluating the significance of the properties. And two outcomes can come out of this. Either there are no historic properties affected because nothing is eligible or listed within the area of potential effects, or there are historic properties that are affected. You have an eligible property, which tells you then that you need to go on to the next step and the next module. One last thing is the letter that goes to SHPO to consult on the first few steps needs to contain some specific information. One is the date, because that lets you know when when you've sent something to SHPO, and then when it gets to SHPO, the day they receive it, they log it in and they assign it a number. And for Caltrans projects, it's an FHWA number that has the date, and then there's usually a letter like A, B, C, or D. That's the number of the item that was logged in that day. So if something went in from the Forest Service, it would be the Forest Service abbreviation, and it might be 2012 January 5, and then a B, and it means that it was the second project that was logged in that day for that agency. And that number then follows the Section 106 process in California through all of the communications with SHPO. That tells them what project you're referring to. So it's important that we know when initiation of consultation is beginning. It's a good idea to have an attention line for the project review unit so that the person logging it in can direct it to the right department or unit within SHPO, and it can get lost if it's not there. They have to read through a letter to find who it's going to. In this case, you identify that it's a federal undertaking, and you state in the first paragraph whether it's initial consultation or whether you're continuing consultation, and refer to the part in the code which is the 36 CFR 800, so they know immediately, oh, we have a federal undertaking here. It needs to go to project review. I have a slow computer here. You also identify the materials and explain the purpose of the materials. And in this case, Caltrans uses the term Historic Property Survey Report when it initiates consultation under Section 106. And it is where the details are contained, so you can have a succinct letter without it going on for pages. And then you summarize the scope and scale of the project. So this is a brief project description. It gives the SHPO a first glance of how big a project they're going to be looking at and maybe how much time in the future they're going to need to be able to spend on it. And then identify where the reviewer can find more detail. And then in the subsequent paragraphs, you summarize the first steps through the process that Tristan was talking about, including the APE and the consulting parties and the background research that you've done, and then you describe what you found in the APE. And in this case, there's a listed property, and again, for the transmittal letter, you're still providing the applicable criteria, level, period of significance, and the date of the listing or determination if it was previously evaluated. And then you clearly state every item that you're requesting concurrence on. If you don't ask them that you want to concur, that you're asking for their concurrence, they don't know what to do with the letter. They have to be provided with the section of 106 that you're asking for their comments under. And in this case, we're requesting concurrence with the eligibility determination under 800.4. And informing them that there are historic properties in the APE under 804 D2, so they know, oh, this is what we have to comment on. Identify the length of review period, and in this case, if you don't get a response from them, and that response can be, we need more information. But if you don't get a response from them in 30 days, you can then move on, you as a federal agency can move on to the next step in the process. But if everything goes well, you'll get your response within 30 days. And you can talk to them to see whether they plan to respond within that time frame, but give them a chance at least to take a look at it. And then if you need to go on to another step, you can state what other consultation might be required and that you intend to continue consultation at a later date. There are some of these pieces of information, you'd be surprised how much of it gets accidentally left out. You need to identify the lead staff person or the project person that SHPO can talk to for additional information. And you need to make sure that the letter is signed by somebody with the authority under Section 106 to be able to be communicating with SHPO. In this case, our environmental branch managers have the authority to consult with SHPO. It's important that it's signed by someone with the appropriate authority. And then you need to make sure that you've disclosed what your enclosures are and that you're notifying any other consulting parties as appropriate. So that's just kind of a brief overview of portions of a letter that need to be included in initial consultation with the SHPO under 106. And finally, the relationships to effects and NEPA, an APE and a good historic property summary goes through the entire Section 106 process. It informs assessing effects, as you'll learn about in Module 2. It can be lifted wholesale and put into a NEPA document so that somebody has a succinct paragraph that describes that property. And then the description of character defining features informs the application of adverse effects and then helps to develop mitigation measures. Jennifer?
Yes, I am here. Well, thank you all for joining us today. At this time, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the box and let us know, and I will ask the panelists to answer them. So I have one question to start out with, and again, Gloria or Tristan, it's if one of you would care to answer that. The first question is, at what point is an agency required to begin the Section 106 process?
This is Tristan here. I'll answer that. It's really up to the agency. Unfortunately, a number of times, I've noticed this in a number of consultations, the agency person doesn't know about Section 106. So it comes in at the very end of, when they want to disperse the funds or they have the funding in place and want to get the construction rolling, and then they realize that they have to consult. So I think it's important to start early. The earlier the better, especially for larger projects. It's not
so
that hard to do. Yeah.
This is Gloria. I would say that as soon as you know that you've got funding or that you need a permit, the question to ask is there federal money involved? Do we need a federal permit? Do we need a license? At the very beginning, when you're considering the project, and you know, for instance, if you're applying for a grant and you know you've gotten that grant money, that's when you start the process. That's when you need to start looking at what the impact might be, what your area of potential effects might be, and to initiate consultation with SHPO.
Yes,
and I would say talk to a cultural resources person. That's when you would know, oh, I got to talk to a cultural resources specialist.
Certainly, and I'd like to add, if someone from the agency who's granting you the money or permitting your action hasn't contacted you, call them and get a hold of your appropriate person there. But again, it's oh yes, earlier the better. Always you can send a letter off to the SHPO very early in the process and at least get it on our radar and let us know what's happening.
Another thing is, and we didn't really mention it, but every federal agency has a federal preservation officer. And if you really have no clue, you can go onto the Advisory Council website. They have a list of SHPOs and federal preservation officers, and you can contact the agency and say, who in your agency am I supposed to talk to? But generally, you're going to get some of that information when you apply for funding or apply for a grant. And that's when I would say, just talk to somebody and say, who do I talk to about 106?
ACHP is the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation.
And they have a website that I can never remember if it's .gov. It's ACHP. I think it's .gov. But if you Google the Advisory Council, you can get their website, and then within there, there's a list of state historic preservation officers. I believe there's also TIPOs, and there's a list of the federal preservation officers.
I have another question. Is there recourse for an interested party to pursue if the agency has waited too long?
Oh gosh, that probably needs a little bit more information to be able to answer that. Waited for long for what?
Waited too long to start the Section 106 process. For example,
sure. An interested party certainly can come in at any time. I encourage persons or organizations who feel they've been left out of the consultation process to write to the federal preservation officer with the agency that's funding or performing the undertaking. Let them know that they've been left out of the loop, and see the SHPO. I mean, you can assert yourself at any time.
Contact the SHPO.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what I was just going to give that example. You know, what we're dealing with the post offices now is when we first started hearing about it, I kept calling Tristan to say, have you heard anything? Have you heard anything? And then after that, since they hadn't heard anything, we went directly to the Federal Preservation Officer as well as the staff liaison to the U.S. Postal Service at the Advisory Council to ascertain whether a process had started, a consultation process has started that we were not involved in and we had requested to be involved in.
That's a very good point. And also the Advisory Council website has a list of staff and the agencies that are assigned to that staff.
Another question. Cultural resource management professionals make recommendations for eligibility. Who determines eligibility, the federal agency or SHPO?
The federal agency makes that determination. It is always the federal agency determination. SHPO concurs or disagrees?
Yes, that is the case.
Next question.
And then if there's a disagreement, as I mentioned, then if they can't resolve it, it goes to the keeper, and the keeper's decision is final.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question. If you guys do have any more questions, feel free to type them up, and if I have any left over, I will send them to our panelists. But for the last question today, can you touch on just a little bit more on the indirect APE?
Sure, certainly.
Go ahead.
Lori, you want to give it a go?
Okay. You'll learn a little bit later in assessing effects about the criteria of adverse effect, but one of the criteria is if you're introducing something that is out of character with the property or its environment. So, for instance, if you've got an historic district with a mature vegetation and they're modest houses that are 1 or 2 stories in height, and across the street a high-rise is proposed, that indirect effect would need to include the historic district across the street, because it's the potential for introducing a big building that's out of character and could cast shadows permanently on the district, or it can change something atmospherically. So you need to look at a much broader area for indirect effects. For Caltrans, for our projects, typically we're looking at 1 row of properties beyond the direct impact, but if it were, for instance, an elevated structure, then we would look farther beyond that, depending on what that view shed would be for indirect effects.
Tristan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with what Gloria is saying. You really have to consider the scale and scope of your project. If it's involving hundreds of wind turbines in a corridor, then it's going to be a much larger APE than a roof replacement in a tract home neighborhood. It's really commensurate with the scale and scope of the undertaking.
So if you have a single property, and as Tristan was mentioning earlier, everything around it, is out of character, doing something on that property, it would probably just be the property boundaries. Replacing a roof on the property, I think, would be just the property boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us today. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to a survey. We would appreciate any feedback on this webinar, as well as recommendations for future topics. You should all have received a link to today's presentation, which I can resend later today. Also, our next module in this webinar series will be on June 26th. As you can see in front of you, there's a total of 4 modules in the Section 106 series. So the next one will be on defining effects and providing mitigation. I hope you all have a good rest of the afternoon, and thank you again to Gloria and Tristan for joining us today.
And thank you, everyone, for joining.
Yes, thank you for listening.
All right, well, thank you.